Okay, and we're COMP308, and it's week 4, lesson 4, part 4. And we're back to talking about jQuery. Yesterday we talked about the content delivery network and how to set up jQuery, and also how to get code hinting for jQuery. We talked about how a jQuery uses shorthand to navigate or traverse the DOM, the document object model, right? That's what jQuery does, shorthand, right? So this is what it looks like. jQuery uses this $, and again, it uses parentheses, and in here for elements, or if you can also look at the same kind of targeting that we do with CSS. So CSS looks at elements and their descendants for specificity to target those elements from a styling perspective, or if you want to enact a method as an example. And we're using the dot accessor methodology to use jQuery, right? So again, we have these built-in, some common jQuery methods. Like for example, the value, and there's getters and setters, of course, that they've kind of they've included in jQuery for us to get and set the value of different elements. So example, if I said the val, if I use the val command, this would be a getter to get the value, let's say, of a text box or other form control. A value, right? So if I had, let's say, a value of 5, my user entered 5, and I want to get the value into a variable, I would use value. If I want to set the value of a variable, some kind of, or the value of a text box, some kind of entry form control, then this is where I would use val, right? Text is actually the inner HTML. So instead of using inner HTML, like with JavaScript, I would use text. So this way I would target the text inside of an element. Right? That's when I can actually modify the content of a page, right? And what I can do is I can go to the next sibling of an element or the next sibling of a specified type, right? So if I wanted to move to the next one, if I have to traverse the DOM, I could do that by going next. Whatever this element is, to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, right? And I also can do a submit. A submit actually submits the form, right? If you're doing forms. And I can shift the focus. This is another thing I can use. These are all built-in methods that come with jQuery. And here's some examples of this. So example, I'm targeting an ID of gallons. So some text box with an ID of gallons, they're entering the number of gallons. And I want to put it into a gallon variable, right, in JavaScript, right? So I can use jQuery to get the value. This is a getter for the value of gallons, whatever they entered, into the gallon variable. That's what this is. And here I want to use the setter to set the text of a paragraph tag to a certain a certain piece of text. Okay, so let's think of that. I want to set the text. So what if I wanted to? I can do this by doing event handling, and jQuery does event handling very nicely. So we'll combine this in a little example here in a second. Okay, so here's an example of what jQuery does with an event method name. So jQuery handles events really nicely. It handles a little bit differently than the add event listener that comes with JavaScript, right? So example would be, here's my selector, and then I can have a method name and the callback function. Here's my callback function over here, right? So there's a couple of methods. The .ready, so this event handler runs or triggers when the DOM is ready. So I can listen for the event being ready, the DOM, right, when my page loads, and as soon as my document is ready, I can fire it and go. The other one is on click. So if I click on a particular element, like a paragraph tag or a button or something else, I can create a click handler or a click event. And jQuery, if I go back to my Visual Studio as an example, and I go to my index.html, here's my index.html right now, and I have not much in here in this example. By the way, for those of you who weren't there, if you want to follow along, you can always download the stuff from online to keep track. So I have a hello world headline tag, and my first paragraph, which is with an ID of first para. I just made that yesterday, right? But I want to have a button, and remember in HTML you can create buttons by simply going like this, button. Right? That's not part of jQuery. That's just part of HTML5, right? My button doesn't do anything right now, and I can name the button, my button. Right? That's the actual text that's inside the button. And then I can give my button an ID, right? So my ID is, let's say my button, right? So there's my ID for my button. Okay, so when I click my button, right, then I want my text in my first paragraph to change. Okay? And then, by the way, you can do click, you can do hover, there's all kinds of things you can do. Well, let's suppose I want to click my button here. And I want to use jQuery to do this all. First of all, let's see what it looks like without running the jQuery. So here's my button. It looks like the basic styling of a button, right? And this comes with HTML. I have to restyle this thing if I want my button to look different. Okay? So if I click on it right now, it doesn't do anything, right? It's not doing anything because it's just a button floating in space right now, right? But if I want it to do something, then I have to target it. Oops. I got to target it with my in my Solution Explorer. Let me just stop debugging here for a second. I can do that within my app.js. So first of all, in my main file, this is what I'm using the same kind of methodology I did before. On load, I'm accessing my main method, and my main function inside my JavaScript file fires, and I have this first thing where I get the value of the text. I get the text, and I spit it out to the console. That's what I'm doing. But now we're going to do a little bit different. Instead of getting the text, I'm going to set the text. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do that first by, I'm going to set up a when the button is clicked event, right? So, okay, so I'm going to listen for if the button is clicked. So if, and I'm going to wait for the button click. If I say button click, actually let me just do this, console.log. Let's see what we get when we go like this. $, right? And if I say, and if I target a selector and it's my button, right? So here's my button selector, and I've got to put a, it's the same way I'm targeting everything else. If you notice, my button has to have a $sign in front of it because I'm targeting my button typically, right? That's how we would typically look at it first with CSS. So if my button, right, if it's clicked, I'm going to start typing the click value. So here's my click, right? If that's true, then I can do something, right? And if you notice, if I just do this, it says my object or parameters. If I go back down here, if I go back to the basics, right? My click was waiting for a handler, some kind of handler. So I can't just do this. Well, I could do this, but it's not going to do anything. Let's see what it does. So I'm just going to output to the console. I'm just going to get rid of this for a second, right? And output to the console what happens when I click my button. When my button is clicked, I want to output the result, whatever this returns. What does my button click do to the console? Let's test that out. So I'll run it. Let's see. You're right, but let's see. Well, I know that's what I'm hoping for, right? So let's say here's my JavaScript console, right? I'm going to refresh, right? And if you notice what it says here, it says, hey, look, I got a button that I'm outputting, right? And it's doing it right away. I haven't even clicked the button, right? If I click my button, it doesn't do anything because it just returns, right, this button event. That's all it does. There's no function. It's just the function my button, right, in app.js line 4, right? It does return something, though. It returns the actual object, okay? What I want to do is say, okay, this is cool. I want to return, doesn't return true, right? If my button is clicked, right, if my button is clicked, that's what I want to say. So if I do this, right, my button, so here's my selector, and again I'm going to use my button. And then on my button click, right, that's what I want to do. Then I can create a function call, right, to button click, my button click function, right, which I haven't defined yet. Right, it's my button click function that I'm calling. In order for me to run this button click function, right, I've got to define it somewhere in the code. Now, usually what we would like to do is do it to before, but it doesn't have to be. So let's say here's my function, right, and we call this button click, and it's what we're going to do here is console.log. Oops. That's bad. My button is clicked, right? Only when it clicks, it's going to run this event handler. So the event listener is here, my event handler is here, And when I click it, it's going to go to the console if it makes sense. If it's right. Let's run this thing. So I go back. I'm just going to kill some of these other instances here. And I'm going to go back to my developer tools on the JavaScript console and click my button. See? My button is clicked. If I keep going, the number here increases more and more and more. Because what it's doing is it's responding to the event. So it's kind of almost like a built-in, if this button is clicked, then. All in one line. That's the shorthand we're talking about. So it saves you all that extra typing, because you'd have to put in, for a JavaScript event listener, you'd say, whatever the JavaScript event listener, dot add event listener, the click event, and then the callback function, right? Here, I'm just specifying a button or any other kind of element. It doesn't have to be a button. It could be a paragraph. It could be whatever that I click over. And it'll do something, right? So this is this little piece of code. So now that I've clicked my button, this is good. And here I'm doing an output to the console. Well, you know what? I want to use jQuery again to do the same kind of thing we did down below. So I'm going to say something like this: jQuery. That's what the $sign is. I say when I talk jQuery, I say jQuery, do this for me, right? jQuery, target the peak tag, right? Seriously, and then in the text, I want you to get the text element and set the value of my text element to, you know, I just clicked the button, right? And within a literal, string literal, I just clicked the button. Clicked, CK, come on, Tom. So that's going to change my paragraph text. My paragraph text starts off as one thing, and now I'm going to replace that paragraph text when I click the button with this my own. I just click the button, right? That's the first thing I'd like to try and do, and I can get rid of this because I don't need this anymore, right? So I can actually change. I'm actually making changes to the page. I'm rewriting the page. Let's check that out. So I will stop and start debugging again. Kill one of the first instances of this thing, and if it works now, if I click this button, it should change my paragraph text to what it is, right? So I'm rewriting the code on the page, the text, the content on the page. I'm replacing the content with my own content, and jQuery can do that, like I said, like I showed you here, in like one line, 2 lines, right? That's a big difference from what JavaScript does. JavaScript takes a lot of little things to do: get element by ID, get element by tag name, and then from there, if this is this, then replace it. It takes a lot more lines. So that's what jQuery does. It has its built-in library with that takes a look at these things and replaces, you know, your JavaScript functionality with this $sign and selector methodology.
So is the callback function in the main method?
It's right here. So I'm calling the callback function. I could also do an anonymous callback function, right? Which you normally would see. So I don't have to do this, right? You can also call an anonymous method. It's more challenging for people to see it, though, but it looks like this. Okay, it goes like this: function. So there's an anonymous function, and inside there you put 2 curly braces, right? This is the syntax, right? And it looks like this. And then inside here, I could do this, and then I don't have to do a callback function out here. I could do it in here, and I'm gonna put this in stasis here for a second. So I'm gonna kind of do one of these, and I'm gonna take this and put it in here, right? And then you can see what it looks like. So here, this thing here is exactly what I did before, except in one line, and it's using an anonymous function to do it, right? So here's an anonymous function with a callback that's inside the body of the actual event listener. This is what you'll see a lot online if you look at it. And if I refresh, right? And let me just refresh that to make sure, and I click onto it, it does the same thing, right? It's no different, just a different set of doing things. The problem with this anonymous callback function is, if I want to do something over and over again, or if I have a lot of functions that do the same thing, and I want to share the function, I can't, because it's anonymous. I can't call it. It doesn't have a name. It's an unnamed function, right? It's good if I want to do a quick and dirty kind of solution to something. But if I want something where I need to do several lines and I want to call it from different functions, then I want to create a callback function like I did up here. So 2 methodologies. What was that? Not here. Can't call it in here, right? Here, I've named my callback function button click, right? And so therefore, if I just undo, I'll show you where I go back to. This is what it looked like before. I'm I'm just going to get rid of my anonymous function here. Right? It looks like this with, I call my button click. Here's my button click function. I'm calling it, right? So here I call my button click, right? Event handlers is what it is, right? And this is my button click event handler up here. Button click event handler. And this is my event listener right here. This is my event listener. So we listen here for a click with this my button click methodology with jQuery. We listen for it and then we respond to it here. Two different piece parts. Event listener, event handler. Or you can do an anonymous function to create your event handler method. Okay, so this is the piece that I wanted to show you today for event handling. Because once you do event handling with jQuery, and by the way, instead of using this other methodology that I've done already with index.html here, if you notice that onload is equal to main, I don't have to do this. I could do it like this, right? I could put this document.ready function in my code, and then when it says when the document is ready, well then you know what? Let's do all my stuff in here. All my code could be encapsulated within this anonymous document.ready function. I could, right? I could. And this is the short way. You don't have to even use the document access the document class itself, right? The object. You don't have to access the document object. You're just going to do this. The shorthand is this: function, anonymous function inside the jQuery, and you're good to go, right? I don't like this. I like this because at least I know what's happening here. I have the kind of event handler, and then the callback function, whether it's anonymous or whether it's a named function in here. That's just me as a coder. I don't like it, right? Not to say that it's not correct. Here's some other ones. I've got an H2 tag. Here's my H2 tag, my headline, right? And I want to click on the headline for some reason, right? Well, here's my anonymous callback function that's inside of here that I can make an alert, right? And here's where I would do both. I'm waiting for my document to be ready, and when my document is ready, then listen for my click of my H2 tag, right? You don't need to do this if you do the onload, in the body tag. So again, we used up until now, and I want to go slow with jQuery so you understand. jQuery uses a set of selectors similar to CSS that we're comfortable with already. If you know CSS, you know jQuery. If I can target stuff with CSS, I can target stuff with jQuery. The great thing is learning all the different built-in functions that come in with jQuery that you can do. So here's an example of that. So, I've got my selector up here. But if I start doing this, and I specify my p tag again, right, and I click dot, if you notice it has a bunch of other things that I can do here. Append to, I can change, I can click, I can clone. There's all kinds of other event handling that it does as well that's built in. Like, for example, hover. If I want to hover over my button, what happens, right? So I want to do a hover event, right? And when I hover over my button, let's do that one. So there's two different event handlers I'm going to use now. So I'm targeting my button, and we'll stop here after this. Here's my button, and I'm going to do, instead of a click, I'm going to do a hover. So on my hover event, I want to do something. Now, if you notice, here's my function, and there's two. There's on over. This is the hover event, and if you notice my code ending on out. So I have two callbacks I can use, right? So what happens when I go over the button, and what happens when I go out of the button, right? So an example of this would be I have two event handlers. So here's I'm going to call on button out. On over, or button over. Let's call button over, right? And then button out. Now I haven't declared those two things, right? I can do that here like I did before. Function, right? Button over, right? So it does something, and then function button out, and that does something as well. So I declare my buttons this way. So button over, button out. This is where it happens. This is an event handler. This is the event listener. This is the event handler. Two different events for the same element, the button, right? So here's my button over, and I want to maybe when I'm over the thing, I want to change my p tag, my p element here. If I can actually type before they run into the class, the text in here to say I'm over it, right?
Can you change CSS styles?
Yes.
Do this as well?
Yes. That's what I'm saying. Change CSS styles. You can change opacity. You can change everything. So it gives you a lot of control. Like, see, jQuery is very powerful, right? And I want to target my p tag again, my p element, all p elements, by the way, and not just one, just everyone. I only have one by chance. I want to change the text, you know, to I'm out, right? So I'm over and I'm out. So let's see if that works, and let's run it. So if all things go good, and if I've done it, if I've handled it correctly, and I'm just going to refresh. If I just skim over the button, then I'm over it, and when I'm out of it, I'm out. When I click over it, I click onto it. But then the problem is if I move out of it, it enacts the other event handler, right? As I move over it, I'm out, and I click onto it, I go, but as soon as I move it, it's done, right? Two different event listeners working on the same element.
So any function that you pass as a parameter to another function is the callback function.
Correct. The callback function piece is, again, you can use an anonymous or named function as your callback. There's two pieces to an event. The listener, it's listening for the event. If you notice, I have two listeners, right, that I've set up, right, in my app.js. I have this first listener here for a button click, and this second listener here for the hover. And if you notice, I'm using the click and hover methods built into jQuery for each and every element on the page. I can do this, by the way, right? And then I use, for this one, the method signature is only one callback method, and for this one, it takes two callback methods.
You can send the second parameter as null or something, right? So it doesn't do anything about it.
Yes. This one here you're talking about. Yes, you could send null, or you can make it an anonymous empty function like this. Function doesn't do anything. You could do that as well, right? The problem in here is, see how there's nothing in here, right? Because you're calling an anonymous function in here. You've got to put something in there to make it do something, or else it's going to error out. But there's some really good examples online on how this all works, right? But this is the basic idea here is that I can create event handlers very quickly with jQuery that allows me to manipulate the content of my pages, right? And if you're thinking about manipulating CSS, again, if I was going to look at if I talk to my p tag here, so not only am I out, but I want to change my p tag element, right? So here's my p tag, and I go .css. Oh, in there, I can put whatever name and value I want. You know, so for example, I can change the value like I can put a whole series of CSS things in there like I normally would put in, with a name and a value.
Is the next assignment going to be on jQuery?
We're going to use jQuery and jQuery Mobile. So that's why I'm doing it with you, so that we understand jQuery and jQuery Mobile. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be like, Tom, what the hell? We haven't done jQuery, right? And I'll tell you right now ahead of time, your little test for midterm is going to be on jQuery Mobile, right? So we're going to do a jQuery Mobile test where you do a little jQuery Mobile app in class, okay?
jQuery mobile app in 2 hours?
Yep.
Or in 1 hour?
2 hours.
Is it just practical?
No, it's going to be our midterm. Practical
So
only.
it will be theory, practical only. 2 hours.
Yeah. So if you're not good at it, right, and if we haven't practiced it, you're going to get mad at me, right?
Yeah, we got to practice.
So we have to practice, right? So we have to start off with this stuff and move towards Ajax and then a little bit of jQuery Mobile, right? And then we'll get into the actual stuff.
The actual stuff being Node.js.
All that really good stuff that I like, yeah. The really good stuff that I like.